You hear it before you open your eyes. A dull clang of metal on metal. Someone knocking a little too hard on the aluminum trailer door. You are only asleep for a few hours, and the inside of your mouth feels like it's been dusted with chalk. There's a single lamp glowing in the corner of the small room, the kind that never truly darkens, even when you twist it off. You roll to your side, reach for the script pages that slipped between the sheets the night before, and remember, this is day 12 on a 19-day shoot, and your call time is, once again, 4 o'clock sharp. You've been cast in 3 films this year, with a 4th being whispered about by your agent. You'll finish this one, rest for a day, maybe, then head straight into rehearsals for the next. No questions asked. Because under the studio contract system, you don't work for yourself. They'd powder your face until you looked unnatural in person, but perfect on celluloid. Your skin couldn't shine. Your eyes had to catch the light just right. Any flaw, a scar, a pimple, an uneven brow would be magnified on the big screen. You learned to sit still, to stare into the mirror without really seeing yourself, to become a canvas, not a man. You work for a machine, and that machine doesn't sleep until the director, the producer, the cinematographer, and sometimes even the studio head watching from a private booth were satisfied. This is Hollywood in 1942, not the one in headlines or gossip columns, but the one lived quietly in the in-between hours. Or meeting with a publicist who reminded you, once again, not to be seen in public with certain people. You learned to smile, even when your molars ached. If the crew was behind schedule, they pushed. Always. The union rules were young then, enforced unevenly. And actors, especially younger ones like Reagan in the early years, were expected to say yes. Always yes. Often, you didn't know what time it was. You stopped asking. Time didn't matter on a set. Only light, only angles, only performance. You were being groomed, marketed, sculpted, and any personal misstep could lead to reprimands or worse, a pause in your rising career. In the early 1940s, he was under contract to Warner Brothers. They were hot, suffocatingly hot, from the giant studio lights that hummed and buzzed above. The heat made you sweat, which meant makeup had to constantly touch up your face between takes. The lighting setups could take hours. A single scene might be filmed from 5 or 6 different angles, requiring multiple takes, multiple resets, and endless patience. There were days you spent 6 hours filming a conversation that lasted 30 seconds on screen. One of the big 5, he had started with a few sports movies, usually cast as the nice guy, the wholesome boy next door with an easy smile. But behind that smile was an endless rotation of costume fittings, line memorization, rewrites, reshoots. You slipped into the character's clothes. Maybe you were a football coach today, or a young lieutenant shipping out to war. You'd been all of them before. It didn't matter anymore. You pulled on the wool suit with a stiff uniform, feeling the scratch against your skin. Costumes were rarely comfortable. They didn't need to be. They only had to look good in black and white. And the exhausting grind of being reshaped again and again by the studio's whims. He had no control over what roles he was given. If Jack Warner said you were a cowboy this month, you learned to ride. If next month you were a Secret Service agent, you learned how to look serious in a trench coat. That was the job. That was the deal. The one where you, a contract actor under Warner Brothers, have no say over your schedule, your co-stars, or sometimes even your haircut. A PA with too little sleep and too much responsibility. You mumble your acknowledgement and sit up slowly. The air is thick, stale makeup, a hint of mildew from yesterday's costume drying too close to the radiator, and the unmistakable scent of hair pomade. You rub your eyes and make your way toward the little sink. No time for a real shower. There hasn't been for days. You splash cold water on your face, the same way you did the day before, and the day before that. You belong to the studio, and the day ahead belongs to them. The bleary-eyed rituals, the quiet grind of becoming someone you're not, for an audience you'll never meet. There's a knock again, firmer this time. Or some vague version of yourself that grows less familiar by the week. The makeup artist is kind, but doesn't talk much anymore. You're on your 5th film together. The silence between you isn't uncomfortable. It's just efficient. Her hands move with practiced precision, brushing, patting, layering. Sometimes she hums. Sometimes she sighs. She's been here longer than you have. And she be here after you're gone. This is not the glamour that the magazines promise. This is the other side of the silver screen. At 4:20, you're in the makeup chair. The trailer buzzes with fluorescent light, and you glance at your own reflection, not yet transformed, still yourself. The studio expects 12-hour days, minimum. And that's just for shooting. Reagan knew this well. And the mornings were the worst. Makeup lasted about an hour, sometimes more, depending on the film. By 5:30, wardrobe had arrived. At 6 o'clock, you were on set. Sets in the 1940s weren't glamorous either. And through it all, you had to smile, or frown, or weep on command, over and over again. Lunchtime was rarely restful. Usually you sat in your trailer, eating from a paper container, going over the next day's pages, or giving interviews. Imagine trying to eat while someone fixes your tie and another repowders your forehead. This wasn't unusual. This was routine. You learned to chew between touch-ups. Afternoons blended into evenings. Some nights, filming extended past midnight. If the crew was behind schedule, they pushed. Always. The union rules were young then, enforced unevenly. And actors, especially younger ones like Reagan in the early years, were expected to say yes. The trailer smelled of sweat and stale coffee. You collapsed onto the narrow bed. Maybe read a few lines. Maybe wrote a few. Reagan liked to write. Even then, notes, thoughts, little reflections. Often mundane, occasionally profound. Always yes. When you did get back to your trailer, around 1 a.m., maybe 2 o'clock, you peeled off the costume. Your body sore from holding poses. Your eyes dry from endless takes. Then your eyes would close, just for a moment. And suddenly, the knock again. 4 Emmett begins again. The exhaustion wasn't just physical. Never the one they built entire films around. He was solid. Dependable, but not extraordinary, at least not in that world. It was existential. The studio saw him as safe, clean, reliable. But safe roles don't always satisfy the soul. And quietly, a question formed in him. Was he just memorizing lines, or could he one day speak with his own voice? Not even when the lines blur together in your head, and the sweat is beginning to trickle behind your collar. Not even when you've smiled through your 5th scene of the day, trying to remember if you've already delivered this exact monologue in another movie, with another name, but wearing the same face. He had a clean-cut look, the kind that could be inserted into nearly any script without raising eyebrows. He wasn't rugged like Bogart, nor mysterious like Grant. He wasn't brooding. He wasn't dangerous. He was likable. And in Hollywood, likability can be both a gift and a trap. In the world you now inhabit, every take is a test, every close-up a contract you haven't yet earned. You're not a star. Not yet. You're an actor under contract, and if you're lucky, you'll stay that way. If you're not, you'll disappear. Something more permanent, more real, more lasting than a scene lit by artificial sun. Not like Gable, not like Davis. You're closer to the edge of the marquee than the center, sometimes left off entirely. And though your face is familiar to the crew, and maybe a few devoted filmgoers, you're still just that guy from... You exist in fragments, A soldier in one film, a baseball coach in another, a smiling fiancé in a third. You don't get to choose who you are. The studio decides that. Your only job is to fit the mold. The trouble is, the mold never changes. And if you can't break out of it, you'll never rise beyond it. You weren't quite a person anymore. You were a product. And every day chipped away at your sense of self, the ache in your shoulders. These were films churned out quickly, made on smaller budgets, often filmed on leftover sets from bigger productions. The plots were formulaic, the dialogue stiff, the schedules merciless. You'd shoot 5 or 6 pages of script a day, sometimes more, with little room for nuance or subtlety. If you forgot a line, you just started over. If the scene felt flat, the director might say, "Print it anyway." Time was money, and you weren't the priority. The tightness in your lower back, the weight of the schedule pressing on your chest. You smell the pancake makeup. You hear the murmured cues. You see the red light blink on. For Ronald Reagan, this pattern went on for years. Dozens of films. Countless scenes. He rarely played villains. He wasn't offered them. It's easy to forget that Reagan wasn't a superstar. He was well known, yes, but never the highest paid. And that's why the mornings hurt more. Because in those bleary-eyed hours, beneath the powder and the costumes, was a man slowly realizing he wanted something else. You feel it too now. And still, you perform. Because that's what the contract says. Because that's what they expect. Because somewhere, just maybe, someone out there will see you, the real you, behind the smile. But most of the time, they won't. And the morning calls will keep coming. Until you find your way off the set for good. The camera never blinks. Not even when you're tired. It's the early 1940s, and your name doesn't sell tickets. For Reagan, the mold was the nice guy. Dependable, upright, sometimes patriotic, sometimes romantic, but always safe. B-movies were the starting point for many, but for some, they became a ceiling. These were films churned out quickly, made on smaller budgets, often filmed on leftover sets from bigger productions. The plots were formulaic, the dialogue stiff, the schedules merciless. You'd shoot 5 or 6 pages of script a day, sometimes more, with little room for nuance or subtlety. If you forgot a line, you just started over. If the scene felt flat, the director might say, "Print it anyway." Time was money, and you weren't the priority. Imagine being cast as the lead in a film and knowing deep down it won't be remembered. You'd read reviews that described your performance as adequate, pleasant, or sometimes simply didn't mention you at all. You'd hear someone say, "If he lands this one, it'll change everything." But the truth was, breakout roles were often given to those who already had influence, connections, or just a spark of timing that no one could control. Reagan didn't have family in the industry. He didn't come from money. He didn't have a scandal to stir interest or a mystique to draw curiosity. He had discipline. He showed up on time, knew his lines, was easy to work with. You might write in a journal or pace your trailer at night, wondering if you'd ever get to say something that came from you, not a screenwriter, not a studio head, but from your own voice, your own truth. You'd walk past studio billboards with your face airbrushed beside a co-star whose name carried more weight. And you'd wonder, silently, if this was as far as it went. And even your best performance will be buried beneath hundreds of others just like it. That the studio has already moved on to its next project, and you're just the placeholder for today. Craft publicity that aligned with the image they wanted to sell. You might be asked to pose with dogs, children, or in patriotic attire, reinforcing your wholesome appeal. You'd go on radio programs, reading scripted interviews that made you sound personable, upbeat, uncomplicated. You were a brand, and deviating from that brand meant risking your position entirely. All American, It was often the line, not the performance, that people remembered. You'd audition for a part that might stretch you, a troubled character, a moral gray area. What was it called? You'd smile, nod, say something polite, and try not to let it settle in your chest. The fact that your face was known, but not remembered. That your performances flickered briefly in someone's mind and vanished like smoke. And you'd be told gently, you're not quite right. Which meant, you don't seem dangerous enough, or complex enough, or marketable enough for this kind of film. You'd return to the trailer, slip into another clean-cut costume, and say lines that felt like echoes of last month's role. Win one for the Gipper, they said, but they rarely said his name. He became a quote before he became a star, a slogan without a legacy. And yet, you show up, you memorize, you rehearse, you perform. Casting directors would glance at your resume and see the same roles repeated. They wouldn't imagine you in anything else. You were the happy-go-lucky guy, the good friend, the nice brother, but never the lead in a major drama. Never the complex anti-hero. Never the risk. Because in this world, the only thing worse than being typecast is being forgotten. Reagan starred in films like Girls on Probation, Love is on the Air, and Brother Rat, titles that today might sound quaint, even charming, but at the time were considered second-tier projects. He played radio announcers, boyish lovers, and everyman soldiers. Not glamorous roles, not award-winning, but steady work. Work that kept him on the studio's payroll, even if it didn't push him closer to stardom. And even when a promising role came along, like George Jip in Newt Rockney, being stuck in the B-movie loop meant more than just bad scripts. It meant being seen in a certain way, over and over again. And once the public saw you that way, it was nearly impossible to change their minds. You'd go to premieres where your film was screened as the second feature, after the real draw. There were whispers, always, about breakout roles. And in Hollywood, sometimes that's enough to keep working, but never enough to rise. The grind of it wore you down. Sometimes fans would recognize you, at a diner, at a gas station. Aren't you the guy from that picture? Typecasting wasn't just about roles, it was about control. The studio would photograph you in a certain way. Privately, you'd feel the dissonance. The disconnect between who you were and who they wanted you to be. But dreams cost time. And time cost money. And in the studio system, your dreams were secondary to your deliverables. Reagan weathered this reality with patience. He wasn't the kind to rebel openly. He worked, he waited, he stayed visible. He accepted the roles they gave him, even as his ambition drifted quietly toward something different, a stage of his own. One where the lines weren't handed to him, but chosen by him. One where the audience wasn't hidden in the dark, but standing in the sunlight. But before that could happen, he had to endure the loop. The cycle of roles that felt smaller than his voice. The worst part wasn't failure. It was stagnation. The long plateau where hope slowly drained and the spotlight remained just out of reach. The constant waiting for someone, anyone, to take a risk on him. To see more than the square jaw and the steady gaze. To see the mind behind the mask. It was the era of myth-making, when studios were not just producers of films, but creators of identities. He understood what it meant to be edited, not just on screen, if you missed a luncheon, if you failed to send a card to the right executive's wife, if you refused to attend the opening of a studio friend's new film, there would be questions, whispers. But by your Q score, your public likability, tracked through polls, fan mail, and press response, even when you hadn't seen your family in weeks. And every moment of honesty, if you dared, was a risk. Even when you were nursing a cold, but still had to pose for a cheerful magazine spread, pretending to enjoy an afternoon picnic staged by the studio on a lot corner dressed up to look like the countryside. They noticed how you dressed at the commissary, who you lunched with, how many autographs you signed, how you spoke to drivers and waiters and costume staff. Because in their minds, a star's value wasn't only in their acting, but in their ability to maintain a palatable, profitable brand, a cooling of the air in your contract meetings, and worse, a sense that the machinery no longer considered you reliable. But in real time, in daily life, shaped by publicists, handlers, columnists, and the invisible expectations of audiences who thought they knew him. If you were single, you were set up on photo-ready dates. If you were married, you were expected to stay that way, or at least pretend to. Divorces were discouraged. Affairs, if they happened, were to be quiet, denied, or spun into something else entirely. And if you had political opinions, even mild ones, you had better make sure they aligned with the studio's bottom line. There were mornings when his name would appear in the gossip columns, often alongside other studio players. A dinner here, a date there. Some of it true, some of it invented, all of it curated. They didn't just hire actors, they built personas. And once yours was built, you were expected to live inside it like a second skin, always smiling, always polished, always agreeable. The brutal climb wasn't marked by falls. It was marked by stillness. And so, you keep going. You can feel it as the flashballs burst around you, each one capturing a frame that won't remember who you are, but only how you looked. You stand on the red carpet, shoulders square, smile fixed, and somewhere deep behind your eyes, you wonder quietly if anyone here knows your real laugh, your real thoughts, or the heaviness you carry when the cameras turn away. Because in this world, in this golden age of Hollywood illusion, everyone watches, but almost no one sees you. Another film, another early call, another pleasant smile for the press, another performance that fades too quickly. You're not a star yet, and you don't know if you ever will be, but you keep going, because what else can you do? There is a peculiar kind of loneliness that grows in plain sight, not in the shadows, not in exile, but under the soft glow of attention. The 1940s and 50s were a time of transformation, not only for America, but for its entertainment machine. Ronald Reagan, long before he stood at any political podium, knew this life well. You weren't allowed to disappear. Not really, not even for a day. Your personal life was not your own. Behind the scenes, executives watched you closely. They gauged your popularity not just by box office receipts. So you smiled, always, even when your stomach was in knots. Every smile was a performance, every handshake a transaction, and every moment of honesty, if you dared, was a risk. For Reagan, this control was both an opportunity and a burden. He rose through the system by following its rules, by playing the parts assigned to him, by trusting that compliance would eventually lead to choice. You're asked to re-record lines in a slightly more cheerful tone, even if the scene is somber. Your voice must be brighter, your walk more confident. You're reminded not to slouch in interviews, not to speak too fast or too slow, not to mention certain political topics. And over time, your real instincts grow quiet. You second-guess your own expressions. You rehearse your answers before you're even asked a question. And to some extent, it worked. He became a recognizable name, a familiar face. The constancy of being on, of knowing that every word you say might end up printed. He was the face of a brand, the ambassador of middle American values. Each week, he delivered monologues that reassured, entertained, or gently educated. But those words weren't always his. They were shaped by writers, executives, and brand guidelines. That a single offhand comment could ripple across studio corridors, coloring how you're seen for months. Still, he shook hands. Still, he played the part. Imagine a life where people think they know you, but only ever recognize your outline. Imagine performing so much for so long that you start to forget what it feels like to be fully, vulnerably yourself. So you begin to filter yourself. You flatten the highs. You sand down the lows. You become agreeable, non-threatening, marketable. But when you return to your trailer, alone, and look into the mirror, the one not framed by bulbs, the one that doesn't flatter, you start to ask quieter questions. Do I still know who I am when I'm not being watched? Would anyone love me if they met the unedited version? But beneath that upward motion was a quiet erosion, a slow forgetting of where the actor ended and the image began. You start to notice it in small ways. You may hear your name shouted by fans, but they're cheering for a version of you created by marketing teams and film editors. Wondering, is there still a place for the real me? Or am I only allowed to exist in costume, under lights, in someone else's words? You may appear in magazines, smiling beside a co-star, but that smile may hide a fight, or a silence, or a sadness that never makes it to print. It becomes exhausting, not the work, necessarily, but the pretending. And that is where the emotional toll begins to deepen, in the gap between perception and truth. You may be surrounded by people, but few know your heart. You might lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling. For actors like Reagan, this tension accumulated over time. He was articulate, thoughtful, a lover of words. But few roles gave him the space to express that. He was expected to say the lines, hit the marks, pose for the pictures, and then fade into the background until needed again. Even as he moved into television, hosting General Electric Theater, the same pressures applied. And still, he smiled. Because stepping out of character, even for a moment, could cost everything. Imagine being watched constantly, but rarely being seen. The studio lights are warm. The suits are tailored. The applause is frequent. This is the heartache of being sculpted for public consumption. Everyone watches, but no one sees. And in that space, that soft, echoing silence between perception and truth, you begin to feel the real weight of fame, not its glamour, not its privilege, but its loneliness. There's something eerily still about an empty soundstage at night. The lights have long since been dimmed, the crew has gone home, and all that remains is the quiet echo of footsteps fading into the rafters, yours. The painted brick walls, once alive with noise and command, now hold only the hushed reverberation of pretend, and kept them shining, at least on the surface. Actors were surrounded by attention, but much of it was artificial. Handlers, agents, producers, journalists, fan club presidents. But the man who quietly wrestled with identity, longing, and the deep ache of disconnection. But as their careers accelerated, and their public lives expanded, their private bond slowly eroded. He delivered his lines, kept his posture, smiled when expected. The studio never stopped calling. He began to shift inward, cultivating a private space for reflection, seeking conversations that went beyond career and fanfare. He read, he wrote. Imagine hearing praise for your charm, your delivery, your consistency, and knowing, in your heart, that none of it is rooted in who you truly are. Imagine becoming successful by the world's standards, while privately feeling invisible, not in the sense of being ignored, but in the sense that your essence remains unseen, untouched, uninvited. He began exploring deeper political and philosophical questions, slowly realizing that his voice, his real voice, had more to say than the scripts allowed. Admired, but not fully understood. Visible, but not truly known. He didn't abandon acting immediately. That would take years. But the distance between who he was and who he was pretending to be began to grow too large to ignore. But in the quiet moments, in the spaces between takes, or alone in his trailer, as the city outside buzzed with imagined glamour, he sat with a growing emptiness, an awareness that his life, as it was, lacked the intimacy and authenticity he craved. Two people, both caught in the machinery, trying to hold on to something real while being told daily how to look, how to live, how to live. Hollywood in that era was not kind to those searching for meaning. Depth was often buried beneath layers of image, and vulnerability was rarely rewarded. To admit sadness, to confess uncertainty, these were considered signs of weakness, potentially damaging to one's public brand. So instead, actors buried these feelings, sometimes beneath alcohol, sometimes beneath endless work, and sometimes beneath the steady weight of silence. When they eventually divorced, it was a deeply private pain, masked behind the gentle headlines of irreconcilable differences, a phrase that, in Hollywood, often meant too many nights apart, too many wounds unspoken. He was warm and charming on screen, but privately he was often reflective, introspective. A man of routine and restraint, who carried his Midwestern values into an industry built on illusion. He was polite, yes, but also reserved, observant, not prone to scandal, nor comfortable with the excesses of the Hollywood elite. He wasn't drawn to the wild parties or late-night escapades. He preferred small dinners, long walks, quiet drives. Solitude suited him. And yet, it came with its own cost. There were people to fetch your coffee, iron your suits, and arrange your appointments, but few you could confide in. Fewer still who would listen without a motive. You sit for a moment on the edge of a wooden crate, not as a character not in costume, but simply as yourself. And in this sliver of unscripted stillness, you realize just how hollow it can feel to be seen by so many, yet known by so few. The loneliest people in Hollywood were never the ones without work. They were often the ones with too much of it, the ones who smiled the widest in front of the flashbulbs, and said exactly what they were told in interviews. The ones whose lives were packaged in studio press kits, but whose hearts remained untouched, unread, and in Reagan's case, mostly unwritten. For the cameras you laughed, you posed shoulder to shoulder. But when the lens turned away, many returned to quiet homes or lonely hotel rooms, with only the flickering of a bedside lamp to keep them company. And some, like Reagan, turned to writing. Not for the press, not for scripts, but for themselves. Quiet, inward monologues scribbled between call times or whispered into journals at the end of another long day. Save for the private letters and personal diary entries, they would not surface until much later in life. Loneliness was not rare in Reagan's Hollywood. It was embedded into the system itself, a silent side effect of the very mechanism that built stars. The illusion of closeness was everywhere. Co-stars were paired not just on screen, but often in gossip columns, suggested romances, exaggerated friendships, sometimes entirely fabricated rivalries. It is in these writings that a different Reagan emerges, not the actor, not the eventual politician. His marriage to Jane Wyman, another rising star, began with promise, with shared aspirations and complementary personas. And yet, through it all, Reagan remained outwardly composed. He continued filming. He continued showing up. The loneliness wasn't only emotional, it was spiritual. Reagan's answer was different. Imagine waking up every day and stepping into a version of yourself designed by someone else. That was the paradox of Reagan's early career. Admired, but not fully understood. Visible, but not truly known. And so, he began to detach. Not with bitterness, but with a kind of quiet pragmatism. He accepted roles, but no longer chased them. He engaged with the public, but increasingly kept his private reflections guarded. He smiled, but not always with joy. He had learned to perform not just for the camera, but for life, a trait that would serve him well in politics, but one that exacted a toll in more intimate spaces. At night, when the streets emptied and the scripts were folded shut, Reagan would sometimes sit alone with a pen, recording the small details of his day, the weather, who he met, what he thought. The tone of these entries was not dramatic. Often they were remarkably plain. It was the unseen backdrop of countless stars, but especially for those like Reagan, who carried more than one dream inside them. The dream to be seen, yes, but also the dream to be whole. But perhaps stranger still is to realize, one day, that the path to being fully known may lie not through more visibility, but through a different kind of service, a life lived not in front of the lens, and the man beneath the performance, the one no one quite sees, he rests, but behind a podium, with words that are your own. But within that simplicity was something deeply human, a man holding on to reality in a world designed to distort it. It happens gradually, subtly, like a ship easing out of one current and slipping into the pull of another. He had become, instead, a familiar figure, dependable, recognized, but no longer at the height of Hollywood fashion. The post-war film landscape was shifting. The studio system that had once shaped his life was loosening its grip. It was to be a weekly program, dramatic but clean, offering safe but compelling stories to the growing family audience, huddled each Sunday evening around black and white television sets. But more than entertainment, it was a branding exercise. Jay wanted not just to sell appliances, but to build an image, one rooted in optimism, order, and the American dream. Reagan fit that vision almost too perfectly. Television, once a novelty, was becoming a force. And Reagan, always pragmatic, began looking for a new stage, one that might still reward his timing, his voice, his presence, one that offered not just scripts, but the chance to speak a little closer to who he really was. For Ronald Reagan, the shift from actor to speaker, from studio script to personal message, began not with a grand pronouncement or a sudden epiphany, but with a single voiceover, a quiet contract, and the slow awakening of a different kind of purpose. Not the pursuit of fame, but the careful shaping of an idea, and the growing belief that perhaps words, real words, might one day move more than just audiences. Perhaps they could move a nation. But in the quiet corners of sound stages, between takes, beneath makeup, and under costumes, the seed was already growing. Lights, camera, loneliness. It's a strange thing to be alone in a crowded room, stranger still to be alone in the public imagination. Reagan did not make that leap yet, not in this chapter, not away from acting, but toward something more. And in those final quiet moments of this chapter, the lights go out, the stage is empty, the script is closed, the makeup is removed, alone, but not forgotten. It doesn't happen all at once, the turning of a life from one rhythm to another. By the early 1950s, Reagan was no longer the fresh-faced actor on the rise. That opportunity came in 1954 with a company called General Electric. They were looking for a host, someone affable, articulate, trustworthy, to be the face of their new anthology series, General Electric Theater. It was to be a weekly program, dramatic but clean, offering safe but compelling stories to the growing family audience, huddled each Sunday evening around black and white television sets. But more than entertainment, it was a branding exercise. GE also asked Reagan to tour their plants across the country, to visit factories, speak with workers, and give talks at civic halls and company gatherings. It was part public relations, part morale building, part subtle ideology. And slowly, quietly, this touring began to awaken something within Reagan that the film sets never had, a conversation. Jay wanted not just to sell appliances, but to build an image, one rooted in optimism, order, and the American dream. Reagan introduced each story with that familiar warmth, occasionally appearing in the dramatizations himself. But even there, the shift was apparent. His introductions grew more reflective, his tone more measured. There was a sense, unspoken, that the man who once played other people's stories was now preparing to tell his own. Reagan fit that vision almost too perfectly. He kept hosting, kept touring, kept refining. The world outside was changing fast. Cold War tensions, economic anxieties, social unrest. But Reagan remained steady, using each factory floor and small town hall as a kind of rehearsal, not for a role, but for a voice. But over time, they grew more pointed, more personal. He began collecting ideas, turning phrases, testing metaphors. From screen to speech, from acting to believing. From Ronald Reagan, performer of roles, to Ronald Reagan, speaker of convictions. Within the Hollywood circle, some raised eyebrows. What was Reagan doing, speaking like that? Hadn't he been just a B-movie actor? But Reagan's transformation wasn't abrupt. It was earned. Forged over miles of highway, hours of conversation, years of paying attention. And though he had not yet declared any intention to run for office, those closest to him began to see it. The growing clarity, the quiet fire, the sense that the stage he truly wanted had just begun to take shape. He would later say that his education in politics came not from books, but from listening to Americans, real ones, ordinary ones working in GE factories from New York to California. These weren't crowds looking for entertainment. They were communities looking for leadership. And Reagan, quietly, began wondering if he could offer that. He spoke of government overreach, of the values he believed were fading, of the strength of the individual and the dangers of creeping collectivism. And people listened. Not with applause lines, not with fanfare, but with stillness. The kind of stillness that tells you the words are landing somewhere deep. He signed on as host, and with it came more than just a paycheck. He met line workers, supervisors, engineers, secretaries. He shook hands not with fans, but with fellow citizens, people with questions, hopes, complaints. And more importantly, he listened. The polished performer began to find a different rhythm, one that involved not memorized dialogue, but reflection, persuasion, empathy. He heard the language of inflation, taxation, bureaucracy. He saw the shape of worry in people's eyes, and for the first time, began to speak not as a character, but as himself. The speeches started simple, light, optimistic. He talked about innovation, freedom, the greatness of American industry. Imagine it. Reagan standing at the front of a factory cafeteria, daylight slanting in through high windows, rows of men and women seated on plastic chairs. No stage, no cameras, just a microphone on a metal stand, and the quiet hush before he begins. He's wearing a suit, not flashy, just clean. He smiles gently and starts to speak. His voice, so long trained for performance, now carries a different timbre. Not of persuasion, but of concern. He talks about how America is changing, how freedom is fragile, how the government grows faster than the people it serves. It isn't a stump speech, not yet, but it's becoming something more than a company message. It's becoming a belief. Back at home, General Electric Theater kept running, week after week. And all the while, he wrote. Not just scripts or memos, but notes to himself. Speeches, reflections, observations from his tours. The shift was not without struggle. Still, he moved slowly. A voice that would soon carry farther than any camera lens could reach. A voice that had once been paid to say other people's lines, now learning to speak its own. And so the drift continued, not a leap, not a break, but a long, quiet crossing from one life into another. It was the beginning of the next act. And unlike anything he had done before, this one would not fade when the credits rolled. There's a kind of writing that doesn't ask to be read, writing that exists not for publication, not for posterity, not even for remembrance, but simply as a place to lay thoughts down. As one might set a coat across a chair at the end of the day. Not discarded, but resting. But in that restraint, in the simplicity, there was a quiet rhythm. A single lamp, a cooling cup of tea, maybe a small radio murmuring in the background. The rest of the house is still. He opens the journal to a blank page, smooths the spine, and begins to write. A man recording his days not to impress, but to remember. The weather, the visitors, a line from Nancy, a fleeting worry, a moment of peace. Like notes in the margin of a longer story no one else could read. One woman told me her son thinks I'm the president already. Had to laugh at that. A man absorbing the expectations around him, feeling the pull of something larger, and quietly wondering if he's ready. Or enough. Funny what people see. Still, the questions were serious. Prices going up. Fears about Russia. A private joke. A quiet evening that grounded him more than any crowd ever could. It's getting harder to reassure them with a joke and a smile, who found solace in routine and strength in the familiar. Some reflected anxiety, the creeping doubt of someone who, even after decades in public life, still questioned his place within it. Nancy was already reading in bed, glasses slipping down her nose. She didn't ask how the day went, just patted the spot beside her. I needed that. The stillness. The way she looks at me when I'm quiet. Sometimes she sees the things I haven't said yet, but it's the beginning of one. The seed of a philosophy that would later become central to his campaign, and eventually his presidency. Unassuming. Each day, a short entry, sometimes only a few words, but never missed. There is something comforting in that. A president still taking the time to write about who visited, how the weather was, how the day made him feel. Not written for the world, but quietly for him. Met with school children in the East Room. One gave me a drawing of an eagle. To record, to steady himself in the rhythm of reflection. Nancy liked it more than I did. She always sees beauty in small things. A mirror, a map, a measure. Small questions that grew into platforms. I need to be better prepared. Maybe more facts. Maybe just more heart. After years of being given lines, of standing inside other people's scripts, he longed to speak plainly and be understood as he meant to be. Ronald Reagan kept such a diary, a quiet, unpretentious habit carried even into the highest corridors of power. I keep wondering if the founders would recognize any of this. I talk about freedom in these speeches, but sometimes I wonder if we're just rehearsing the word. What does it really mean to be free in 1960? And though the entries were often brief, unadorned, and almost stubbornly undramatic, they offered a small, steady window into the interior world of a man who spent most of his public life acting in one form or another. In the years between his last film and his first campaign, Reagan wrote often, sometimes daily, a few sentences, a passing observation, rarely reflective in the poetic sense. Imagine him seated at a modest desk, not in a grand library, but perhaps at a side table in his study. January 3rd, clear skies. Lunch with Charlie. Talked a while about the union business. Nancy's smile was the best part of the day. Starting to think more seriously about writing my own speeches. Maybe then I'll recognize myself when they're repeated back to me. No sweeping prose or flourishes, but there's meaning in the margins. The weather, the people, the emotion tucked in a line about Nancy's intuition. The mind that's still turning, still wrestling with what he hears on the road. She always knows when I'm holding something in. Still thinking about the plant manager in Akron. Said taxes are cutting too deep. He didn't complain, just stated it. That kind of quiet anger is what I keep hearing lately. That's all. Nothing extraordinary. In another entry, perhaps after a long day of GE plant tours and interviews. April 14th, rain in Pittsburgh. Long day, but the workers were kind. Again, short, unpolished, but revealing. There's tenderness in the pages, too. Small notes about Nancy, her strength, her humor, the way she centers him. A favorite meal. May 27th. Got home late. This was a man who loved deeply, even if he said it sparingly. But not every page was calm. October 10th. The press twisted my quote again. I should be clearer, more careful. Words can feel like landmines now. In this, we glimpse something essential. Reagan's growing discomfort with being filtered. And as his thoughts turned more political, the diary sharpened. November 2nd, watch the news tonight. Taxes up again. Government growing too big. too fast. It's not a manifesto. Not yet. Through it all, the diary remained steady. It followed him into the governor's mansion, into the White House. Even during his presidency, Reagan kept the habit. March 15th. Cold wind. Briefing on arms talks. Not much movement. Even with the weight of the world on his shoulders, he returned to the page not to boast or to brood, but simply to be. And there was pain. Quiet, insistent pain that settled into his body in middle age. A gunshot wound, sustained in a movie years before, had left behind lingering discomfort in his back. And though it was often dismissed publicly, just a nagging ache, it worsened over time. Got through the rally fine. A slow forgetting, not traumatic, not noticeable to others yet, but he could feel it, the occasional lapse, the searching for a word, the way a familiar name hovered just out of reach. He was a man who'd memorized thousands of lines in film and television, who could speak for an hour without a note. And now, sometimes, the threads slipped through his fingers. Nancy told me to take it easy, but in the quiet of his own mind, Reagan began to wonder. He never said the word Alzheimer's then. No one did. Not yet. He'd shake hands until his fingers ached, then retire to a hotel room and write down the names of people he'd met, moments he wanted to remember. His diary didn't say much about his body's protests, or the distance growing between him and certain family members. But the silence between the lines said plenty. He didn't retreat. He moved forward always, with a steady hand, with a rehearsed smile, with a diary entry that might read, "Long day, still more to do." Nancy was wonderful, as always. But the fear existed, not as a diagnosis, but as a fog. And Reagan, whether by choice or by compulsion, allowed himself to be consumed by purpose, by belief, by the quiet conviction that his life could serve something greater than itself. Twice, as governor, then again, as president. History remembers the victories. A haze that rolled in unexpectedly, then vanished again, leaving only a trace of disquiet. Not sure I know how. He continued to ride horses, to jog, to stand for hours on stages and behind podiums. But every movement came with a cost. Every smile masked a stiffness. And as his campaign life intensified, so too did the strain. In public, he rarely acknowledged it. Reagan had an almost old-fashioned relationship with suffering, something to endure, not share. His diaries mention the pain occasionally, but only in passing. No complaint, just record. Backs stiff today. But there was something else too. A deeper shadow that even he could not fully name at the time. In the early years, these moments were rare and easily explained away. Fatigue, age, the toll of travel. And still, he pressed on. Because that's what he had always done. Because the cause, whatever it was, always came first. Because the man who had once performed through exhaustion on a soundstage in the 1940s was now delivering speeches through back pain, emotional distance, and creeping uncertainty. Not stoically in the dramatic sense, but with the kind of quiet discipline that's almost invisible until it breaks. There is a cost to being steadfast, a cost to holding yourself together when so much within you longs to rest. Reagan bore that cost quietly. In his campaign for the California governorship, he was tireless. Cross-country flights, back-to-back events, endless interviews. He won, of course. But in the shadows of those triumphs were the soft tolls. The child waiting by the phone. The back that would never quite heal. The quiet fog inching closer. And yet perhaps what's most remarkable is how Reagan carried it all. Not as burden, but as duty. He didn't complain. Ambition is not inherently cruel, but it is consuming. But at night, when the halls were still, when the speeches were done, and the last Secret Service agent had checked the locks, he would sometimes sit quietly, pen in hand, and write one more sentence, just for himself. A sentence that might hold all the weight he wouldn't say aloud. A sentence no one would read for years. And in that act, small, private, steady, the shadows softened. Just a little. It was still dark when he opened his eyes. The kind of darkness that comes not from midnight, but from just before the first light begins to lift the edges of the sky. Washington, D.C. was hushed, not silent in the true sense, but softened. A city that always hummed beneath its own weight, now breathing more slowly in the final hour before history would shift again. In the suite where he slept, simple, orderly, familiar, Ronald Reagan blinked into that stillness and allowed the quiet to hold him. Military bands warmed their instruments. Cameras were mounted on tripods. Reporters readied their notes. But here, in the stillness of that room, Reagan poured a small cup of coffee, sat by the window, and opened his diary. Cold, clear sky. Nancy looks beautiful. Inauguration this morning. Funny, never thought I'd be here. Remember the GE tours. Remember the lot in Burbank. Long road. Quiet inside. Not nervous. Just ... grateful. So many people helped me here. I hope I served them well. This was the morning. The one that followed the years of speaking, touring, writing, doubting, enduring. It was not dramatic. No thunderclap. Just the shape of the day, the shape of his thoughts. The speeches given in factory break rooms, when no one in the press was listening. The dinners with Nancy, where they'd whispered dreams too fragile to say aloud. The ache in his back, the weight in his chest, the loneliness, the hope, the work. No applause. Just a slow inhale, a second of stillness. The world outside would soon begin to speed up. But for this final moment, time was slow, tender, still. His name would be sworn into the history books. His hand placed upon the Bible. His voice, once used for reading scripts, now tasked with speaking for a nation. And then a man, now 70 years old, swung his feet over the side of the bed and sat there, alone, in the calm before presidency. Victory, when it comes, is often imagined in music and banners, in ticker tape, in roaring crowds, in triumphant embraces. But for Reagan, that morning was not filled with noise. Not out of hesitation, but out of reverence. Her presence was steady, her movements precise, brushing a sleeve, straightening a lapel, smoothing a wrinkle from the fabric near his cuff. No words needed. They had shared this journey so closely, so quietly, that much could be spoken in a glance. She squeezed his hand, he smiled, and for a few heartbeats, they simply stood there in the hush together. He dressed without fanfare, a dark suit, well-tailored but unassuming, a crisp shirt, a tie chosen by Nancy the day before. The mirror caught his reflection as it always had, but this time there was a trace of something different behind the eyes. Not pride, not anxiety, but a kind of quiet resolve. A man who had waited longer than most for this moment, who had not chased it in his youth, but grown into it, who knew the path had been winding, unlikely, even strange, but who also knew, somewhere deep and steady inside him, that he was ready to begin. It was marked by the absence of it. The campaign was over. The votes had been counted. The results were known. But the presidency itself, the enormity of it, the sacred weight, had not yet begun. It hovered there in the dim light, waiting. A crown not yet worn. A sentence not yet spoken. He rose slowly. Nancy was already awake. She didn't say much. She rarely did on mornings like this. Elsewhere, the city began to stir. Advisors double-checked documents. Secret Service agents rehearsed the routes. He wrote, as he always had, not for anyone but himself. A few lines. No grand pronouncements. January 20th. Then he closed the journal, set the pen aside, and watched as the sun crept into the room, cold and gentle, brushing across the table like the hand of history itself. He thought, perhaps, of the road behind him, the sound stages, the trailers, the smiling interviews, and now, this, Inauguration Day. But for now, he simply sat, letting the quiet remind him of what mattered. Later, the moment would unfold as planned, the motorcade, the oath, the applause, the address that spoke of renewal, of hope, of morning in America. But none of it would feel as real or as sacred as that early hour before the city woke, when a man became president not by ceremony, but by silence, with calm in his breath, with memory in his bones, with words still unspoken. Because sometimes the most powerful transitions do not arrive with sound, they arrive with stillness. Not on the official tour, not photographed for glossy magazines or state archives, not written into speeches or press briefings. A room, perhaps metaphorical, where unseen influences rest, softly, silently, waiting to be consulted. In the White House of Ronald Reagan, there were many such rooms. But Nancy, and through her, Ron, came to see timing as something worth attending to. Most saw only the logistics, but Nancy saw the invisible currents beneath. A Mars transit, a Mercury retrograde, a full moon in a house of communication. Joan would advise gently that a certain day might bring confusion. Another tool in a very human attempt to bring meaning to chaos. If it makes people feel better to laugh, let them laugh, she once said, always the pragmatist. But those closest to him said he trusted Nancy's instincts, not blindly, but deeply. And if her instincts were shaped, in part, by conversations with Joan Quigley, well, then that too was part of their shared language. But for her, it was never about belief in horoscopes or magical predictions. It was about rhythm, harmony, but it lingered at the edges, in timing, in travel, in tone, a quiet presence, a whispering wall. And Reagan, already in bed, perhaps reviewing the next day's speech, would glance up at her and smile, not in mockery, but in trust. In believing, however quietly, that time itself might have a pattern, that fate might have a rhythm, that the heart, even in power, still listens to wonder. A sense that there was order somewhere in the universe, even when the headlines screamed disorder. A president and his wife would still find themselves at times looking to the stars, not for power, but for peace. And Nancy listened. And Reagan led, or tension, or clarity. Nancy would relay that quietly. And staff, loyal and careful, would make adjustments, sometimes without even knowing the reason why. If a meeting could be scheduled an hour later, or a speech moved to a different afternoon, or a flight delayed by a few minutes, and if doing so might align with more favorable planetary configurations, then why not? These weren't acts of superstition in their minds. They were acts of caution, protection, rituals of reassurance in a world that so rarely offered certainty. But none more curious, more quietly whispered about, than the one shaped not by political advisors or military minds, but by the movement of stars, the turn of planetary alignments, and the subtle, persistent hand of astrology. Throughout history, kings and queens, generals and poets had consulted the skies. Augustus Caesar, Queen Elizabeth I, even Winston Churchill in moments of doubt. But in the hyper-rational, media-scrutinized world of the late 20th century, such quiet mysticism felt like an aberration, something to mock, or question, or fear. And at the center of that invisible influence was Nancy. And on that January morning, Ronald Reagan walked toward history not as an actor stepping into a scene, but as a man stepping into service. A woman who had watched her husband shot just months into his first term, and had felt, in that moment, the cold hand of fate brush too close to her life. After the assassination attempt in March of 1981, something shifted inside Nancy Reagan, something that no bodyguard or staff briefing could quite reach. She began to fear not just danger, but randomness, the terrifying unpredictability of time. And so, quietly, privately, she sought patterns. She searched for rhythm. She looked to the stars. And with a diary closed, for now, but waiting always for the next page, but who for years remained largely unknown, operating not from within the West Wing, but from across the country. Her advice was passed along in phone calls, carefully coded notes, and conversations that unfolded behind closed doors. She never sat in on a cabinet meeting, never issued formal statements, but her influence, subtle, suggestive, drifted into the daily rhythm of the presidency like perfume, faint, intangible, but unmistakably present. There is always a room just off to the side, not the caricature sometimes painted in tabloids or political satire, but a woman both fiercely protective and deeply sensitive. Enter Joan Quigley, a San Francisco-based astrologer whose name would one day appear in memoirs and headlines. It wasn't that the Reagans believed astrology could govern policy. Imagine for a moment the president's daily schedule, a neat grid of briefings, calls, receptions, motorcade departures. This practice, so strange to the political establishment, was not without precedent. And yet, within the Reagans' inner circle, it was simply another layer of care, another filter for decision-making. Nancy herself never denied the connection. In later years, she would admit to it openly, even with a kind of weary defiance. And Reagan? He was more reserved in public. Astrology never dictated the course of a bill. It didn't shape Reagan's economic policies or military strategies. And perhaps that is the most curious part of all, that even in the most powerful office in the world, beneath the grandeur and ceremony at night, when the rooms of the White House dimmed and the city outside slowed to a hush, Nancy might sit near a phone, listening carefully to a soft voice on the other end, speaking of angles and alignments. Because in a world so often ruled by logic and force, there is something tender, almost sacred, in seeking meaning where none is guaranteed. And so the astrologer advised, not by the stars, but not entirely without them. There are dreams that dissolve at dawn, and then there are those that linger, not as memory, but as atmosphere, as a haze that clings to the waking mind long after the body has risen, as a quiet pressure behind the eyes. Ronald Reagan had such dreams, not of battles and victory, but of fire, of silence, of skies turned pale with ash. The Cold War, for all its politics and posturing, lived for him not just in briefings and headlines. It lived in his sleep. It lived behind his eyes, perhaps more fiercely than most. Not because he was naive or unaware, but because he had stared so long into the possibility of destruction that peace had become not just a policy aim, but a kind of moral calling. He once said that the very idea of nuclear weapons haunted him. Inside it, the protocols, the communications equipment, the keys. He joked, occasionally, as was his style. But behind the charm was a man who saw the abyss clearly. And sometimes, when the laughter faded, he would speak not of strategy, but of a world without children, without trees, without mourning. The knowledge that at any moment, should warning systems flash red, the president might have 5 minutes to decide whether to retaliate. The movie was harrowing, showing the breakdown of society, the collapse of families, the slow, inescapable death of a world undone by its own hands. Reagan watched the entire thing in silence. When it ended, he did not speak for a while. Then he wrote in his diary, very effective, of treaties, of meetings in cold rooms with Soviet leaders whose names had once filled his speeches with disdain. Reagan became increasingly obsessed with the idea that a mistake, a false alarm, a computer glitch, a misread signal could end life on Earth. Who had children, a family, a world he did not want to see destroyed. He began to question the systems themselves. How close had we come? Were our policies truly rational, or merely reactions passed down from Cold War inertia? He instructed aides to dig into the protocols, to test the assumptions. He wanted to know really know whether humanity was living on a clock that no one dared to reset. But in that room, for the first time, two superpowers seriously discussed the possibility of eliminating nuclear weapons altogether. Not agreement, but fear. The same fear that had lived in Reagan's dreams. In his diary, to speak from conviction, and to dream, not in fire, but in possibility. In the quiet hours after classified briefings, when no words could soothe the thought of what might be lost in just minutes of war. But with each small step, with each call to disarm, each summit, each letter exchanged, the shadow receded just a little. The world deserves better than what we've prepared for it. And Reagan, once haunted by visions of red skies, became, in his own quiet way, one of the few leaders bold enough to say, "Let us stop imagining the end of the world. Let's imagine something else. I keep thinking about that film. We must do more." It did not end the Cold War, but it was a beginning. The meeting ended in disagreement. Yes, but it planted a seed. And Reagan left Iceland not defeated, but strangely hopeful. He would speak of a world without such threats, not as fantasy, but as goal. And slowly, with pressure and patience, the INF Treaty came into being, eliminating an entire class of nuclear weapons from Europe. It left me greatly depressed. We have to do all we can to see there is never a day like that. 5 minutes to weigh the end of the world. Alone, that he could not, in good conscience, accept a world that lived at the edge of total annihilation. And this was not campaign rhetoric. This was not theater. It was quiet, daily fear. Fear laced with responsibility. And in the long corridors of the White House, past the portraits and policy memos, it was not uncommon to find the president sitting alone, eyes turned not toward his advisors, but toward the window. And the day the earth stood still, which dramatized post-apocalyptic futures and the folly of man's weaponry. These were not just entertainments for him. They were parables, warnings. As governor of California, he worried about civil defense. As a citizen, he read books on deterrence theory. As a husband, he occasionally turned to Nancy in the night and whispered, "What if it really happens?" Toward the sky, always watching. By the 1980s, the world was tethered to destruction. 2 superpowers, thousands of warheads, and a system built on the doctrine of mutually assured destruction. The belief that if one side launched, the other would follow, and no one would survive. It was not an abstract idea. It was detailed, measured, simulated. A plan for the end of the world, written down in careful ink and stored in binders and codebooks. Reagan understood this deeply. He had read the scenarios. He had been briefed on the missiles. He had seen the maps, red circles drawn over cities, each circle representing a fireball, a loss of millions, a silence that would never be filled again. And yet, paradoxically, he also believed in peace. It began long before he took office. In the 1950s, he watched films like On the Beach, and then, as president, he was handed the launch codes. It's difficult to imagine the weight of that. The football, as it's called, the briefcase carried always by a military aide, always within reach. Reagan did not speak of this often in public. One night, early in his presidency, he watched a film on television, the day after, a dramatization of nuclear war and its aftermath. Those words, simple as they are, reflect something deeper. The shift from political posture to personal conviction, from inherited doctrine to chosen path. But conviction did not mean comfort. And perhaps it was this fear, this knowing, that led him to a surprising turn. Diplomacy. Not the diplomacy of niceties and handshakes, but the difficult, frustrating, necessary process of disarmament. But Reagan changed, quietly, slowly. He began to see Mikhail Gorbachev not as a caricature, but as a man, someone else who had read the same reports, who had imagined the same fire. And in that shared understanding, something rare occurred. Dialogue. The Reykjavik summit in 1986 was not a breakthrough in the traditional sense. No treaty was signed. Hopeful, because he had heard in Gorbachev's voice something familiar. Reagan returned from Reykjavik resolved. He would not stop all weapons. He could not. But he would reduce them. He would shift the tone. It was not perfect. And perhaps more than any single act, it revealed the heart of Reagan's presidency. A man once trained to act, to smile, to persuade, now choosing, in the final chapters of his leadership, to listen. Still, the fear never left him completely. The red button was always there. The codes always within reach. And in the quiet of his study, Reagan would return to his diary and write, "Another meeting with Gorbachev today. Progress, still wary, but I think he wants peace as badly as we do. Dreams, when shared, become blueprints." And so he did. With a steady voice, with trembling hands, and with eyes always lifted, not in fear, but in hope. Toward a sky he no longer saw as red. It begins with a room. Not just any room, but the room. Oval in shape, timeless in myth, etched into memory by paintings and photographs. A place where time bends and gravity shifts for those who enter. The walls carried more than wallpaper. They carried stories. The furniture was arranged not merely for convenience, but for flow. The flags were not just decor. They were placement of presence. Reagan's belief in signs, patterns, the mythic language of fate, didn't fade when he entered office. Of liberty as a flame passed down, threatened, protected, eternal. These were not slogans for him. They were truths told in story form, truths he believed in the marrow of his being. He saw the presidency as a stage upon which real change could occur, but only if the people believed in the meaning of the act. A phrase lifted not from policy papers, but from the pages of fantasy. Before meetings with world leaders, he would take a moment of silence. He liked to carry a lucky coin given to him during his acting days. But within the Oval Office, those contrasts softened. The symbols made sense. The rituals grounded the man in the moment. He had a small wooden cross tucked into a drawer in his desk. Reagan was sitting at his desk, not writing, not speaking, just sitting. The lights were low. A desk lamp cast a soft amber glow, even when it's quiet. But unlike the movies, this scene didn't end after 2 hours. This story kept unfolding in decisions, in moments, in symbols carved into time, even when no one speaks. The president looked up, smiled faintly, and said, "Sometimes you just have to sit with it." The aide didn't ask what it was. He didn't need to. When traveling, he often packed a certain book of quotes, favorites from Jefferson, Lincoln, and writers of the Enlightenment. These were not security blankets. They were anchors, echoes, reminders of the deeper current beneath the waves of policy and press. Not formal prayer necessarily, but quiet. A kind of centering. Those who knew him said he carried his convictions like a quiet fire. Not flashy, not evangelizing, but present, always. And walked down the hallway toward his residence. The room remained behind him, quiet, circular, eternal. He spoke of morning in America, not a legislative term, but an image, a feeling. He invoked founding fathers not as historical figures, but as mythic elders watching over the republic. He didn't speak from behind history. He spoke inside it. Only if the symbols were honored, respected, and repeated. If anything, it deepened. Astrology, as whispered through Nancy, remained a subtle influence. His walks across the South Lawn choreographed for mood. Even the way he nodded to the press before boarding Marine One became a kind of signature, a closing gesture in an unfolding performance of leadership. But beyond that, there was a deeper, more abstract spirituality in how he approached the presidency. He saw America as a kind of promised land, not in the theological sense, but in the mythic one. A nation born of struggle, chosen for something higher. A city on a hill, as he often said, quoting scripture, yes, but also weaving his own narrative. And Reagan, with his natural sense of framing and space, understood the language of staging. He didn't see objects. He saw mood. Symbol. The way sunlight hit the desk at midday. The exact tone of the wood grain when lit by afternoon gold. He believed, quietly, instinctively, that atmosphere mattered. Not as manipulation, but as invitation. The Oval Office. A space both physical and symbolic. And for Ronald Reagan, more than most, it became not just a workplace, but a kind of sanctuary, a theater, a chapel, a carefully curated stage upon which he would project not only policies, but archetypes, the mythic rhythms of American identity, woven into the ritual of power. To walk into the Oval Office during the Reagan years was to enter a world of deliberate resonance. Visitors to his Oval Office often noted the comfort, the warmth, a softness that did not undermine the authority of the space, but humanized it. There was a bowl of jelly beans on the table, a favorite leather chair, Western art on the walls, cowboys, sunsets, the open range. These were not just personal tastes. They were signals. The president wasn't just a commander. He was a storyteller. And in that room, every piece contributed to the tale. Behind the resolute desk, Reagan sometimes placed personal items, photos, mementos, small talismans. A bronze eagle, a framed quote, a worn copy of a Thomas Paine essay. These were more than decoration. They were ritual. Each item chosen not for grandeur, but for resonance. Echoes of the past gathered like quiet companions. And then there were the symbols that lived in the shadows, quieter still. Items not part of official inventories, but meaningful all the same. He would speak of freedom, not just as policy, but as destiny. And just as an actor knows the importance of costume and lighting, Reagan knew the power of ritual. His speech deliveries were timed with care. None of this was false. That is perhaps the most important point. Reagan's myth-making was not a veil. It was his mode of expression. Consider his use of language. He called the Soviet Union an evil empire. In private moments, he kept to small habits. Before important speeches, he would read alone. There were other rituals too, small gestures of grounding. In many ways, the Reagan presidency was a study in contrasts. The public man and the private one, the myth and the mechanism. There is a story told by one aide who once entered the office late at night, long after most had gone home. It was the myth, the burden, the presence of all who came before, and all who would come after, the Oval Office echoes. And Reagan, who had once acted in scenes built from plywood and paint, now sat in the most powerful set of all. He was not the first to bring ritual into the White House, but he was perhaps the first to make it feel cinematic. Not in drama, not in spectacle, but in resonance. And when he rose from the desk each evening, turned out the light, still echoing. There are notes we write that no one is ever meant to read, not because they are secrets, but because they are small farewells. Quiet acknowledgments of time passing, of doors gently closing behind us. 2 terms completed. Policies defended. Critics endured. But what lingered, most of all, was tone. A man who remembered names, who enjoyed jokes repeated, stories revisited, faces recalled. A pause too long. A smile that didn't reach the right place. Had lunch with staff. Talked to school group in East Room. Nancy looked beautiful. One, in particular, has remained in the public imagination, the letter he would write years later, after his presidency, announcing his Alzheimer's diagnosis to the American people. It wasn't addressed. It wasn't signed. It read only. But even before that, there were notes that hinted at an internal reckoning, a kind of whispered goodbye that began before the world knew it. Fragile. A pastoral scene. Peaceful, timeless. He looked at it for a long while, then said softly, "I think I've seen this before. I think I liked it." It wasn't confusion, exactly. It was wistfulness. As if the memory lived just beneath the surface, unreachable, but not quite gone. The weight he had carried for 8 years, now beginning to loosen from his shoulders. An entire cosmos of emotion, tucked into 7 words. Perhaps he left it tucked beneath a folder, knowing someone would find it. Perhaps it was just a sentence, or a prayer, or a line from an old movie script that once meant something. They were less detailed now, more rhythmic, as if he were writing not to capture thought, but to hold on to routine. A tether to something steady, a confusion quickly masked, of losing words but retaining feeling, of knowing something mattered, even when its name escapes you. The Oval Office still functioned, but the urgency had eased. The days were quieter. He took longer walks, sat more often with books in his lap, unread, and on his final morning, he stood in the office one last time, alone for a moment before the ceremony. The sun came in through the tall windows. The desk stood empty, clean, and he paused. And Reagan, ever the master of tone, seemed to move through these years with a kind of graceful detachment. He did not resist it loudly. He did not rage. Instead, he drifted, slowly, tenderly, into that quiet. To outsiders, he seemed unchanged. Her presence, once ornamental in the eyes of some, became now the axis of his final stage. A guardian, a guide through the fog. But his eyes at times seemed far away, not lost, but deep inside. But to those closest, there were signs. Early, faint, but undeniable. But somewhere in those final years at the White House, there were moments, small at first, when the lines blurred, a name forgotten, a sentence repeated, a briefing that seemed unfamiliar, though he'd heard it the day before. There was something elegiac in his last months in office, not mournful, but gently reverent. As if he, more than anyone, understood the preciousness of time and the fragility of all things. Behind the public optimism, behind the curated legacy, there were shadows. And the deepest of these came from within. Ronald Reagan left such notes, not only in formal documents or official statements, but in margins, on slips of White House stationery, in soft cursive that trailed off toward silence. These weren't public messages. They were remnants of memory, of presence, of a man slowly retreating from the center of history into a softer, fading edge of it. The end of Reagan's presidency came not with fireworks, but with quiet reflection. Reagan had always been a man of habit. In private, Nancy noticed it first. And yet, through it all, he wrote. The diary entries continued, each one brief, each one a simple account of the day. There were letters too, some dictated, some handwritten. On one occasion, an aide found a small scrap of paper left on the desk after Reagan had gone to bed. I wonder if I'll remember this. Simple. We don't know what he meant. Whether he referred to a specific meeting, a face, a day, or perhaps something larger, the role itself. In another moment, during a private tour with a close friend, he paused in front of a painting in the White House. There is mystery in decline. Not the frightening kind, but the gentle mystery of slipping. And Nancy remained, watching, protecting, filtering. She adjusted the schedule, limited press access, reminded him gently, took his hand at the right moments. Visitors often remarked on Reagan's warmth. Even at the end of his term, he still shook hands, still laughed, still delivered lines. In the last days of his presidency, he spent more time in the residence. Then he reached into his coat and took out a folded sheet of paper. No one knows exactly what it said. It wasn't found later. Perhaps he kept it. But one staff member, who entered minutes after, swears they saw him mouth something silently to the room. Just a few words, maybe thank you, maybe remember this, maybe nothing at all. And then he left, not with spectacle, not with headlines, but with the same quiet rhythm that had carried him through each day, from actor to speaker to governor to president, and finally to citizen again. And the last note, wherever it ended up, remains a symbol, not of endings, but of memory, of what we hold on to, of what fades, and of the deep, unspoken mystery of a man who lived so much in the light, and yet, in the end, walked gently into shadow. History likes to smooth out beginnings. It irons the wrinkles from the early years, frames the photographs just so, edits the sound of uncertainty from voices that were still searching for tone. But real beginnings are not polished. They creak. They shift. They test the shape of new shoes. When Ronald Reagan stepped into the governorship of California in 1967, he did not yet walk like a man of power. He walked like a man adjusting to weight, not just of office, but of perception, of distance, of a life suddenly walled off from the familiar. The formal dinners, though stately, felt staged. Just carpet, wood paneling, carefully chosen curtains, and the smell of Nancy's perfume in the hallway. It was quiet, and for the first time in months, it felt like breathing again. She missed Los Angeles, the rhythm of it, the social circles she'd grown to understand, the comfort of being near what had once felt like home. And so, when she eventually convinced Ron to move out of the official mansion and into a private residence in the East Sacramento suburbs, it was not just about comfort. She became more selective in who was allowed near, more protective of her husband's energy. They had access to power, certainly, to private dinners, insider conversations, curated intelligence, short entries, sometimes no more than a line or two. But they also found themselves increasingly separated from the rhythms of ordinary life. Groceries were delivered, clothes dry cleaned and returned. Conversations were filtered through aides and memos. Even their closest friendships began to narrow, shaped by protocol, by political alignment, by trust. The Reagans learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, how to navigate the social architecture of leadership, how to remain accessible but not vulnerable, how to project empathy while shielding fragility, how to be seen but not fully known. She recognized, far earlier than most, that public service was not just tiring, it was draining. It required constant repair behind the scenes, and she became the quiet engineer of that repair, adjusting schedules, controlling access, managing impressions, meetings with education board. Nancy made chicken, best I've had in months. Some angry, but some curious. That matters. It was about control, about reclaiming the space in which they could be themselves, even a little. The public saw the smile, the easy jokes, the speeches crafted in clean lines. But behind closed doors, the early days in Sacramento were anything but easy. Briefings, speeches, protests outside the gates, reporters waiting at the end of the driveway. The calm interior of their new home became a kind of necessary cocoon, not to shut the world out, but to prepare for its return each morning. And the chair in the governor's office, metaphorically and literally, wasn't comfortable at all. He wrote notes longhand, paced the room with index cards in hand, rehearsed aloud before major addresses. Nancy oversaw the home's rhythms like a conductor, ensuring everything moved with grace. Meals were light, conversations brief, and decorum constant. There was love there, but also distance, the kind born from necessity, from the constant proximity of public expectation. The Reagans moved into the governor's mansion with the cautious energy of guests, entering a house they weren't sure they were meant to occupy. But few lingered long. Social engagements were brief, efficient. Reagan wasn't cold. He was simply always working. Even at dinner, the conversation would drift back to policy, to the next meeting, to the letters he hadn't had time to answer. He carried the governorship with him, like a coat he never quite removed. The structure itself was old, drafty, elegant in a faded kind of way. Nancy found it gloomy. The creaking floors and shadowy corners unsettled her, not in the way of ghosts, but in the way of roots. It wasn't theirs. And in a life now defined by image and symbolism, environment mattered. Ron, for his part, adjusted with grace, but not without friction. The days grew long with learning. The machinery of state politics was far more intricate than the clean lines of campaign rhetoric. The governor's office was grand, but he rarely filled it with pomp. A few personal items sat on his desk: framed photos of Nancy, the children, a small bronze cowboy, a paperweight shaped like a star. These were not statements. They were familiar things in a place that felt, for a time, unfamiliar. There were budgets to parse, legislation to decipher, staff to manage, and a constant stream of visitors, each with agendas, each needing something. The actor-turned-administrator was now being tested on detail, on patience, on the very mechanics of governance. The spotlight had changed color, less glamorous, more fluorescent. He often arrived early to the Capitol building, preferring to sit in the stillness before the day began. Nancy tried to make the mansion feel like home, but the walls resisted. The staff was professional, but not warm. The architecture echoed. The new home was modest by elite standards. Single-story, modern, more glass than marble. There were no antique chandeliers, no visiting historians. But politics, even in suburbia, never rested. Reagan's schedule was relentless. Meetings. Inside, their routines began to solidify. Reagan liked to rise early, brew coffee, and read in his den. Newspapers, reports, the occasional Western novel. Visitors to their home in Sacramento often commented on its cleanliness, its serenity. Nancy, meanwhile, began to cultivate her own form of influence. It was during this time that the Reagans began to understand what it meant to live on the inside of the elite circle, and how isolating it could be. And yet, despite the isolation, Reagan maintained a steady optimism. He kept writing in his journals. Busy day. Rain today. Good day for reading. Budget talks still tense. Spoke to students at Davis. There was a steadiness in him, a sense that even if the chair was uncomfortable, the job was worth the posture it required. The years in Sacramento were formative not because they were triumphant, but because they were difficult. And so they moved, day by day, through that strange chapter, learning how to live in rooms lined with expectation, how to speak in sentences weighed down by subtext, how to dine with those who might, in another season, become enemies. It was not glamorous, but it was instructive. The governor's chair wasn't comfortable, but it prepared them, quietly, relentlessly, for a far grander one waiting down the road. She was always there, but rarely at the center of the frame. Always just to the side, half a step behind, half a second before. Nancy Reagan didn't speak as often, didn't dominate the stage, didn't command rooms in the traditional sense. But her presence was unmistakable. Not loud, but definitive. Like a velvet rope, like the soft gleam of polished silver. You might not see her move, but you felt the shape of her hand in the room. Touch the shoulder, not the hand. Pause after the first sentence. Let it land. And Ron listened. Staffers learned quickly that Nancy's approval was both rare and necessary. She didn't bark orders. She didn't storm. But her silences spoke volumes. A disapproving glance. A pause at the end of a meeting. A polite, let's revisit that plan. It was enough. Her standards were high, not for luxury's sake, but because she believed the White House, and the man who led it, should never be seen as anything less than dignified. Not because he was scripted, but because he trusted her. She became even more watchful. Some criticized her, called her controlling, manipulative, but they missed the deeper truth that she had long ago traded the comfort of being liked for the clarity of protecting what mattered. Not for history, but for Ron, slipped into briefcases, folded beside his pillow. Short phrases, always handwritten, Slowly, without drama, she distanced those who stirred controversy or distraction. Some were kind, some cruel, some pleading. She answered many, carefully, personally, often with a note of empathy wrapped in formality. She kept a small drawer of ones that moved her, stories from soldiers, mothers, children, and names and gestures. It may overlook the moments where Nancy's eyes caught something falling before anyone else did. They reminded her, in the hush of midnight, why all of it mattered. She wanted loyalty, yes, but also harmony. If a staffer leaked stories, made careless jokes, or fumbled in public, they were gently removed, helping him from the car, straightening his coat, pressing her hand gently to the small of his back, guiding him home. If an advisor undermined Ron's authority, they found themselves sidelined. She controlled the narrative not to deceive, but to protect. Her silence was not absence. It was reverence. It was not cruelty. It was curation. He knew that her gaze saw what others missed, the tremble of a lens, the stray hair in a frame, the tension in a reporter's throat. She watched not just him, but everyone around him, always reading, always adjusting. And in many ways, her identity as First Lady was not separate from that bond, but an extension of it. She saw herself not just as his wife, but as his mirror, his compass, his shield. And as his world grew more demanding, as the burdens of office weighed heavier on his shoulders, she leaned in more closely, not visibly, but inwardly. She was, above all, a curator, of mood, of message, of image. She orchestrated moments of rest, turned away persistent guests, shortened speeches, changed lighting to reduce strain. These details, invisible to the public, were constant in her mind. A guardian not only of her husband, but of the presidency itself, not its machinery, but its mythology. And in the quiet hallways of power, where gestures often meant more than statements, Nancy Reagan's white gloves left fingerprints on everything. History often misunderstands her, reduces her to appearances, focuses on her couture, her pearls, her carefully managed expressions. But that outer elegance was not vanity. It was armor. It was strategy. Nancy Reagan came from the same world Ron had once inhabited, the sound stages, the close-ups, the lighting cues. She knew how easily perception could be sculpted, and she knew, perhaps better than anyone, how dangerously fragile it was once achieved. So she protected it with unrelenting precision. The White House under the Reagans was not just a seat of governance. It became, through her careful stewardship, a stage of narrative power. The interiors were redesigned, not with extravagance, but with intention. Draperies chosen not for trend, but for timelessness. She understood, with unerring instinct, the rhythms of political theater, where Ron should stand, when he should wave, which camera angle softened his profile, which lighting made his features glow with quiet resolve. These weren't superficial tricks. They were tools. Because in the arena of public trust, appearance was not deceit, it was language. Flower arrangements adjusted by hand. Guest lists reviewed personally. She consulted with designers, yes, but she led with her own vision. One not of spectacle, but of symmetry. Everything had to reflect what the presidency in her eyes should feel like. Strong, composed, deeply American. And yet, her real influence existed not in decor, but in choreography. She would lean in before events and whisper reminders. Smile, but not too much. Behind the scenes, she was no less meticulous. That commitment extended to the people around them. Nancy was known for trimming the social circle. And always, behind it all, was one unshakable truth. Nancy loved him, fiercely, completely, protectively. She once said, "My life began with Ronnie." She monitored his health with quiet vigilance. She adjusted his schedule, sometimes without him knowing. When the pressures mounted, the Cold War tensions, the Iran-Contra scandal, The slow erosion of memory she began to notice before anyone else. Nancy held the line. There were nights she sat alone in her private room, a single lamp on, reading letters from strangers. And through it all, she wrote her own notes. "You were wonderful today. I'm proud of you. I saw how tired you were. I'm here." White gloves, silent eyes. That was her way. And when the presidency finally ended, when the cameras pulled back and the motorcade disappeared for the last time, she remained, as she always had, one step beside him. Later, as the shadows of illness began to gather around him, Nancy stood like a lighthouse, steady, shining, often alone. And in the end, when history begins to tally influence, when it weighs decisions, but if you look closely at the tapes, at the photographs, at the way the Reagans moved through their years in power, the poise, the polish, the discipline, you'll see her, not at the microphone, but everywhere else. It begins with breath, the slow exhale of a horse beneath a saddle, the morning mist curling over fence posts, the creak of worn leather as the weight of a rider settles into rhythm. The fog moves softly across the hills, not hiding the world, but quieting it. And in the stillness of that hush, before the phones ring, before the cameras chase, Ronald Reagan rides. Some said it was just another Western indulgence, a nod to his cowboy persona. But to Reagan, it was something far deeper, a place untouched by the performance of power. His hands, which shook so many others in formality, found different use here, pushing wheelbarrows, gripping tools, brushing down his horse. There was something poetic in it, the trail half hidden, the world softened. He once wrote in a note, "The fog lifts slowly like memory. It teaches patience." Alone on the ridge, he would stop and watch the clouds roll through the valley, the sky layered in hues of gray and silver. There were no microphones there, no motorcades, just the breath of his horse, steady and grounding. The rides became shorter, the work more symbolic than strenuous. But still, the ritual mattered. The walk to the barn, the slow saddling of the horse, the mounting, the exhale. He rode nearly every day when the weather allowed. Just him, the trail, and a deep internal quiet. He wasn't speaking, just watching the fog lift from the hills. The aide approached quietly, unsure if the president recognized him. Reagan turned, smiled faintly, and said, "I think I've been here before. Feels like I belong here." It was enough. Nancy would sometimes join him for shorter rides, or sit with him on the porch in the evenings, a blanket over their legs, watching the light fade. To know the curve of a trail, the roughness of a rope, the way the wind moved through trees that do not care about poles or press. But Reagan kept the rituals the same. He'd serve lunch on paper plates, show them how to ride, offer lemonade in tin cups. Not the actor, not the president, but the rider in the fog, following familiar trails with nothing in his ears but hoofbeats and wind. But those who visited understood quickly that this was no performance. This was essence. The ranch was not a retreat from who he was. It was a return to it. Mikhail Gorbachev once came, and Reagan insisted he see the barn, the tools, the homemade furniture. The Soviet leader remarked on the modesty, the absence of opulence. Reagan just smiled. "You don't need gold trim to breathe well," he said. They rarely spoke much on those nights. They didn't need to. After so many years of sharing the stage, the silence became their dialogue. The Secret Service followed, of course, in distant vehicles, trying to remain invisible. But Reagan seemed to slip past them, not in geography, but in mood. Once on horseback, he left the role of president behind. He returned to the boy from Dixon, Illinois, the lifeguard, the young man who dreamed by rivers and walked barefoot in cornfields. The man before the image. Here he chopped wood, mended fences, dug post holes by hand. He repaired the porch himself, sometimes with nails too long or boards slightly askew. He laughed about it. He didn't care. The imperfection was part of the charm. The land didn't need polish. It needed presence. Not as president, not as icon. Just as a man with reins in his hands, as often as his schedule would allow, he returned to the ranch. Sometimes for weeks, sometimes for hours. He and Nancy would drive up the winding road, past the chaparral and sandstone, to the simple gates. The air smelled of pine and dust. The birdsong was different than in D.C., slower, more solitary. Nancy called the ranch heaven. For Reagan, it was more than that. It was memory. It was rhythm. It was what the world had been before expectations. And silence in his ears. This was his sanctuary, his retreat, his favorite luxury. Not wealth, not influence, but space. And at Rancho del Cielo, the ranch in the sky, he found the one thing Washington could never offer him: peace. Tucked away in the Santa Ynez Mountains of California, Rancho del Cielo was never grand by elite standards. The house was modest, the land rugged, the amenities simple. There were no manicured gardens or glittering chandeliers, no private chefs or polished brass. Just oak trees, dirt trails, and a sky so vast it seemed to rest on your shoulders. But Reagan loved it, fiercely, faithfully, with the loyalty of someone who understood that real freedom doesn't glitter, it breathes. He bought the property in 1974, when his governorship was ending and the future was still uncertain. And so he gave it that. He rose early there, before the sun, often. Coffee on the stove, boots by the door. Riding through fog became one of his favorite rituals. He had favorite spots on the land: a rocky bluff where the sun fell just right in late afternoon, a tree with a split trunk where he often rested. Guests occasionally visited, world leaders, celebrities, friends. To some, the ranch was a charming quirk of Reagan's persona, a cowboy president leaning into myth. Even in later years, when the presidency was behind him and the shadows of illness began to settle in, Reagan found solace there. One aide recalled seeing him standing at the fence line one morning, long after his memory had begun to fade. There is something profoundly human in that, the desire to belong not just in rooms of power, but in open spaces. And perhaps, in the end, that was Reagan's truest self. No slogans, no applause, just breath, just sky, just peace. Some goodbyes aren't spoken, they're danced. Not as performance, but as ritual, as closure. And on that January night in 1989, beneath the chandeliers of the White House and the muted gleam of history's watching eye, together they stepped onto the floor, hands intertwined. Some do it with words, others with letters. The Reagans did it with a gesture, with this final dance, slow and sure, amid a room of watching eyes. The symbolism wasn't lost. Reagan had always understood the power of framing. But in this moment, he was not performing. He was remembering the years, the rooms. They were brief, almost conversational. He thanked the room, his team, his country. He made a few gentle jokes. But there was a different cadence to his voice, slower, more reflective. As if he knew this wasn't just another occasion, but a punctuation mark. A full stop after 8 long years of commas and clauses. The nights spent under the pressure of expectation. The days blurred by duty. The laughter. The tension. The way Nancy always touched his arm, just before he walked on stage. They returned not to the ranch, not yet, but to a quieter home. No more morning briefings. No more policy papers stacked on the desk. No red telephone. Just coffee and windows and space. The reporters turn their attention elsewhere. You begin to walk down streets where no one leans in to whisper your name. The office of the former president took shape. Letters still arrived by the hundreds. Well-wishers sent flowers, books, framed photos. But the rhythm had changed. and a drawer, rarely opened, where he kept notes from his presidency. Not the official kind, the personal ones. Slips of paper with words from Nancy, children's letters, a faded program from his inauguration, a napkin with a quote scribbled in the corner. All great change in America begins at the dinner table. He liked that one, kept him away from the noise. The world still saw the smile, the wave. But at home, things were changing. He'd forget where he placed a note, repeat a question. Trails of thought sometimes wandered off. At first, they were written off as age, exhaustion. But Nancy saw the pattern. She knew. And quietly, they began to retreat further from the public eye. The urgency had drained from the air. And in that softening, there is both relief and ache. Still kissed Nancy on the forehead when she passed by. But there was a gentleness to him now, a softening. As if the layers of performance had peeled back, revealing something even simpler beneath. Not the actor, not the leader, just the man. Quiet, still, present. And though they smiled, always smiling, those closest to them knew this was not just a dance. It was an ending, not of love or of dignity, but of motion, of the stage, of the public choreography that had defined them for decades. Ronald and Nancy Reagan shared such a moment. It was the farewell ball, their final evening as first couple, a last turning beneath the lights. Outside, the city of Washington stirred in slow celebration. But inside that grand hall, everything moved as if underwater, slowly, deliberately, like memory forming in real time. The orchestra played, the guests applauded, the cameras flashed, but for just a few minutes, it was only them. A man and a woman who had shared a life not just together, but through the very center of American power. The music was soft, the room filled with warmth, but beneath it all, there was a hush, the kind that comes before the curtain falls. He was in a dark tuxedo, she in shimmering white, poised, composed, elegant as always. There is something profoundly human in the way we say farewell, and now they were stepping off it. The ball that night was luminous, not garish, not loud, but steeped in sentiment. Friends, allies, longtime staffers. The men and women who had helped shape the arc of the Reagan years now stood gathered in evening attire, lifting glasses, exchanging stories, knowing, even if they did not say it, that an era was ending. Not just a presidency, but a mood, a tone, a way of holding the office that blended formality with friendliness, performance with purpose. After the dance, Reagan gave a few final remarks. Then they exited, not in fanfare, but in quiet grace. The motorcade carried them away, past the monuments, through streets lined with streetlights and invisible memories. And that is where the real farewell began. Because when the music stops, when the applause fades, something shifts. The world no longer orients around your voice. The calls slow. For Reagan, the first months out of office were filled with motion, events, speeches, reflection tours. Nancy, ever protective, now became even more so. She watched him more closely, managed his energy. There were moments of pause, not confusion, exactly, but searching. And yet, Reagan remained Reagan. He still read aloud from his favorite books, still took slow walks, still polished his boots, still wrote short notes on yellow pads. In his study, there remained the final photographs. A few letters framed on the wall. A globe he used to spin slowly while thinking. And on his desk, for a while, there remained a stack of thank you letters he never quite finished replying to. One day, he sat down and began to write. To those who carried me, thank you. He paused, then wrote another line. The music was beautiful, then stopped. He folded the paper and tucked it into a book. No one ever found it again. Because not all farewells are meant to be read. Some are simply lived. And then gently let go. And now, as the echoes of old speeches fade, and the soft curtain of time drapes itself once more over the corridors of memory, we come gently to the end of our journey, one that began not with a war or revolution. The last staffer has gone home. The air is still. There are no cameras, no briefings. The halls echo only with the footsteps of memory. In the Oval Office, the desk is clear. A yellow notepad sits undisturbed. He believed in something called morning in America, not as a slogan, but as a deep, unshakable instinct that things could begin again. A sentinel of silence, a keeper of love, and the world watched not with fanfare, but with something rarer reverence. The kind we offer not to legends, but to people. Because in those final years, as his thoughts slipped further from the public past and closer to some internal, unreachable shore, the world did not turn away. It slowed, it whispered, it remembered that even when skies darken, the horizon still matters. Let history, for now, keep its own watch while you drift gently into sleep. In many ways, he governed like he acted, with rhythm, with repetition, with faith that words shaped outcomes. Not always correctly, not always safely, but always with intent. And perhaps that is why, long after the books close and the statues collect dust, it's not the policies we recall most, it's the presence. The pause before allowing. The way his head tilted when listening. The way he said, "Well?" Like a grandfather about to begin a story. A lamp glows low, and beside the window, perhaps, a man stands quietly, hands in his pockets, looking not out toward history, but inward, toward something even older. A sense of purpose, a thread of conviction. Not to tell us what happened, but to gently remind us that all things, even power, even fame, even great presidencies, must one day soften into story. And what a story his was. There were times, surely, when even he wondered, not about decisions made or battles won, but about the quiet price of carrying the weight of so many eyes. And in that, you are not so different from them. Power sleeps, greatness breathes, for listening, for remembering. And in the hush between today and tomorrow, there is peace. Of being the one who must smile first, walk first, reassure first, even when unsure himself, but with a voice, a screen, and a man whose life drifted like smoke between cinema and country. And in the space between our lives and its long shadow, there's room to rest, to reflect. And so, here, beneath this soft light of memory, we let the noise fall away. We let go of the myth and the debate. We let go of the roles and the rumors. We're left only with a man who began by telling stories on a black and white screen, and ended by writing a quiet, final chapter on the world's grandest stage. Ronald Reagan was, in so many ways, a story of two Americas. The golden one that dreamed with wide eyes through flickering projectors, and the serious one that sat beneath the shadow of missiles and iron curtains. He belonged to both. And yet, he belonged wholly to neither. Like the old train whistles of Midwestern towns, or the lingering crackle of a radio in the still night, Reagan's legacy does not shout. It lingers, drifting somewhere between belief and performance, between certainty and storytelling. Imagine now, just for a moment, the White House after hours. You see, history doesn't sleep. It murmurs. It flickers. He loved jelly beans, wrote letters by hand, wore brown suits even when gray was expected. And when the story finally ended, when his memory itself began to fade from him, year by year, name by name, Nancy remained. And perhaps that's all we ever truly ask of history, not just to record, but to remember. Not just to inform, but to comfort. So tonight, wherever you are, whatever burdens you carry, know this. Even those who seem to stand tallest under the world's gaze must one day sit down, take off their shoes, and rest. Thank you for walking this path with us. through movie sets and policy papers, through lonely letters and last dances. Thank you for slowing down. And now, rest. Close your eyes if they haven't closed already. Let the rhythm of this night carry you. Let the echoes of yesterday quiet into dreams. Good night. You're standing beneath an old stage light. It's been turned off for hours, and the bulb is still warm. The studio is quiet now. No more calls for makeup. No more shouts of action. Just a faint, constant hum from a distant generator, and the occasional creak of a metal rig above you. Dust dances in the faint golden beam spilling through a skylight. Imagine waking up at 4 a.m. every day, not to read briefings. Governor, candidate, president. But this transformation wasn't a clean costume change. It was slow, subtle, and lonely. Others say he let the forgotten stay forgotten. And while we won't debate policy tonight, we will enter the spaces where the myths were made. We'll ride horseback through the morning mist at his California ranch. Run our fingers across velvet tablecloths at state dinners. Let your breath slow down. The rhythm of their lives, the early mornings, the endless handshakes, the long car rides, the sound of pens scratching paper will gently carry you across time and walk through a world of flickering light, quiet doubt, and unspoken legacy. And whether you stay awake or drift off, know that this story isn't about Reagan as a statue or slogan. It's about a man walking quietly through history, step by step, often alone. And pause in the quiet elegance of Camp David, where Reagan, once the B-movie star from Illinois, sat alone with a pen, writing "Another Day Closer to the End." The White House under Reagan wasn't just an office. It was a stage. A place where astrology charts hung quietly behind security briefings, where Cold War fears turned into midnight phone calls, and where dreams, sometimes strange, sometimes deeply human, surfaced in the silence. We'll explore those mysteries together. What did Reagan believe about fate, destiny, and danger? What did he dream about when sleep finally came? Through imagined readings of his private diary, reconstructed with care and based on real entries, we'll hear the thoughts he didn't share in speeches. We'll feel the tension between public hope and private fatigue, between confidence and confusion, between the voice of a nation and the voice in his own head. But to sit under hot lights while makeup artists pressed layers onto your face, preparing you to play a man who isn't you. Imagine being told what to say, how to laugh, where to look, all while your own identity, ambitions, and hopes simmer quietly beneath a crafted persona. We'll start there. Not in a palace of politics, but in a crowded trailer with a cracked mirror and yesterday's script pages scattered on the floor. You run your fingers along the frayed edge of a costume once worn by a man who played cowboys, soldiers, and hopeful lovers. You don't know it yet, but that man will one day hold the nuclear codes of a superpower. Tonight, in this quiet, you'll begin walking through the secret world of Ronald Reagan, not the myth, not the politician, but the man who sat alone with his diary, writing into the dark. Hello again. Welcome back to Echo, where we gently close the pages of the past so you can drift softly into your dreams. Tonight's journey begins on a quiet film set in 1937 and ends in the echoing silence of the White House halls in 1989. His diary, kept quietly even in his years as president, is not filled with state secrets or dramatic reflections. Instead, it reads like a man taking quiet account of each passing day, the weather, who visited, how he slept. It is in this simplicity that we discover the weight of the life he carried. Because behind every calm entry, had lunch with the Joint Chiefs, went for a ride at Camp David, Nancy made dinner, there is always a second voice. The one not written down. The one that asks, am I doing enough? Do they believe me? What comes next? But we won't be marching through history with flags or fireworks. We'll walk the quiet path instead, The one lined with personal notes, unopened letters, whispered doubts, and memories inked under low lamplight. Reagan was known for his voice, for speeches that stirred millions. But the voice we allow here tonight is much softer, the one he used when writing to himself. Before he ever entered politics, Ronald Reagan was an actor bound by contract to the studio system, an exhausting, image-controlled world where your smile was polished and your sleep rationed. Then we'll follow him out of that world into another role entirely. But Reagan's presidency, like all power, was wrapped in myth. Some say he saved the economy. And finally, we'll take a quieter route through the elite spaces most Americans never saw. There is no need to stay fully awake for all of this. Let your body grow still. So let's begin. Let's pull back the heavy curtain of the past. Step quietly into his shoes. This is Echo. This is the secret diaries of Ronald Reagan, from movie star to president.